weekly threat intelligence hot shots. That's what we're calling it. Aren't we calling it hot shots, Alex? I guess we have for the past 13 episodes.
You're
I'm
late to the
Peter.
party, man. Yes, it's hot shots.
I'm Peter, and I got my good pal, senior threat intelligence researcher. No, threat intelligence analyst.
Yeah.
Alex Ryan. How's it going today, Alex?
Yeah, it's good. I'm cosplaying winter. I'm hoping it'll get cooler.
Nice. Should we get to it?
Yeah, let's get to it.
Cool.
Right. So, there's a lot going on in the media around the election, and I think it's warranted. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what we think the election is going to look like for all of us. Because I think that, especially in my mind, I can think to myself, well, I don't do anything in election land, right? I don't run any polling servers or things like that. So, sorry for my fellow administrators, but, it's not me this time around. But unfortunately, that's not true, because in order to implement the attacks that we expect to be coming, it's going to affect the entire internet, if you will. The internet has become a small world all of a sudden, and we're seeing a lot of interdependencies, especially with third-party providers. So as we move into this time frame around the elections, we're going to see attacks that leverages other kinds of architecture or systems in order to execute those attacks.
It's so like less than 90 days or something like that.
I don't know. That sounds about right.
Yeah.
That sounds about right. And so what are we talking about here? So there are multiple types of threat actors, and they're motivated by different things. And that's going to drive the types of attacks that they launch. So some of them are hacktivists who want to take systems offline so that they get media coverage so they can promote their cause. Some of these actors are state-sponsored, which means that they want to impact the integrity of the election, either by changing things or by deleting data would certainly be an option.
Or misinformation, of course.
Yes. And then there's misinformation, where websites and other kinds of systems will be used, even just in sort of a periphery sense, to send misinformation. So when we're talking about websites, we've seen very complex interrelations of websites where they're all saying the same thing, which is wrong. But because those sites are compromised, threat actors are able to post the information. And when you see it enough times, people can begin to believe that it's misinformation. So lots of ways to leverage infrastructure that's not specific to the election. So
what's funny? I'll tell you just real quick. It just came out of my mouth as you were, making those lists. And it was after, we had that, minor exchange that I then saw that was the last tick on the slide. So maybe that's what you were laughing at. I swear I didn't pre-read it. it just came out.
I don't know if I'm more insulted that you pre-read it or just really happy that it was obvious that this was going to be misinformation. So anyway. All right. So moving on. So what I wanted to do, look, I built the slide and I made everything blue just to help you read along. That was helpful. All right. So moving into the attack lifecycle, hope you guys enjoy these slides because I spent way too much time building them out, but I love slide decks that build. So we have our threat actors here on the right-hand side. So we're talking about hacktivists, state-sponsored folks, and domestic extremists. Domestic extremists are obviously folks who are in the country who, they can actually instigate physical attacks as well. These aren't listed in this attack life cycle, but just keep that in mind, that being able to use physical attacks by domestic extremists are very much on the table at this point. We saw critical infrastructure being attacked by domestic extremists in the last couple of years. So that's not unknown, right, in our environment. So think about that. So they
You know,
have
you mentioned the physical attacks, and those
Mhm.
are quite real, unfortunately, in our society these days. But each three of those also can deploy their own slew of bots to also kind of re-amplify the misinformation messages that they want to get out.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right, so we've got our threat actors. We've got some bullseyes down there that by color tell us what kind of motivation they have as far as an impact. So what we've seen is threat actors really build up these botnets. So we're really going to focus sort of on DDoS at the beginning. So CISA did release an announcement last week in conjunction with the FBI talking about how denial of service attacks may affect the elections coming up. Now, the CISA report was basically saying it may take things offline, but it's not going to affect the election, which I think is them just trying really hard to get ahead of of the misinformation campaigns, right? They're sort of running their own campaign right
Yeah.
now, saying, "Don't worry, it's going to be okay. Things might not be available, but the election will have integrity." So, and that drives our confidence, right? So that they're really trying to get ahead of that with messaging. So what we've seen threat actors do for the past year and a half is really build their botnet infrastructure. These have been Soho routers, IoT devices that are both internet facing and not, right? Sometimes those IoT devices are compromised from a system inside of their local network. So even though they're not internet facing, they have been compromised. And because there's millions of them, it's a very large attack vector or attack surface that threat actors can use, and they certainly have. And then also cloud resources. We have seen virtual servers, virtual resources in the cloud being hijacked for crypto mining, for denial of service. And oftentimes, organizations won't see that jump in resource use and the resulting bill that comes at the end of the month. So if an organization isn't monitoring for system usage throughout the month, those resources can be hijacked, and then you foot the bill at the end of the month. So look for that as well as an opportunity.
Yeah.
Okay. So where would they be targeting? So when we're talking about denial of service or misinformation, we talked about websites. So why we're sort of all in this together is that taking down another organization's website, even if it's not even remotely related to the election, does create a platform for an hacktivist to give their political speech using the media, right? So they will take a website down, that will get media cycles, then they come in and give their pitch. So even if it doesn't have anything to do with the election, that website, how they want to use it, that is definitely related to the election. So just be aware that your external resources are going to have an increased threat over this next 90 days.
Yeah, and they want to grab that credit, that cred. I did it. And recently, right? I mean, just like within the last couple of weeks, a DDoS attack took Microsoft down for a little bit.
Yes.
That had to have been pretty massive. And then specific to elections, I seem to remember something in the midterms. I want to say it was Mississippi had like a DDoS attack. Again, didn't impact the results, but certainly kind of created, some pause, some confusion, some anxiety, things like that.
Yeah, so we're absolutely so from that, right? So it was a hacktivist that took both Mississippi offline as well as Microsoft, some of their products offline, cloud resources last week. So what we're seeing is what I would say is a little bit of a test run, right? So in
Mm.
Mississippi, they took things offline and they were like, wow, that really did create havoc. That's great. That's what we wanted. Now they are using this huge botnet infrastructure that they have built to really create some impactful DDoSes. We did not, hacktivists in the past have sort of been underfunded and sort of a little chaotic and not very sophisticated with their tools. However, this has changed. So that attack that happened on Microsoft last week was a huge DDoS attack, very impactful, quite sophisticated from the use of the botnet perspective. The
Yeah.
attack itself isn't sophisticated, but the infrastructure required in order to launch that is. And so we're really seeing them ramp up. And that's something that CISA had warned us about, I think last month as well, saying that there were some pro-Russian hacktivist groups that had previously been using not so sophisticated tools, which have now definitely upgraded their toolkit and their ability to be impactful. So we're seeing that come to fruition.
They got game now.
Yes, got game. All right. So where else could we see a denial of service type attack happening? Well, once an election or sort of a city infrastructure has gotten the data from their polling stations, it usually goes to their data center where it's consolidated and then sent to, say, a federal consolidation point of data. However, it could also be that it goes directly to the polling data collection, say by the federal government. So what happens is you can denial of service where those polling results are going. So why would you do that? Even though denial of service is not sophisticated, it creates chaos. It will create delay. It will impact the availability of data, which will create the impression of chaos, and people will question its integrity. So
Yeah.
we're seeing that even though these resources are held in the cloud, even the cloud infrastructures at this point might not be able to thwart these level of denial of service attacks.
And just that instant moment of panic when they realize it ain't working. That what do we do now? What do we do now? Oh, hopefully we got, you know what I'm saying?
Yes, no, it is. It's sort of a psychological
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
impact attack, if you will. Yeah. So, so how else might this affect people who are not necessarily in the election infrastructure? But also, let's take a look and see if you are in the election infrastructure, right? So if you are a small town, or if you're a mid-sized town and you are hosting the polling stations and things like that, there are possibly devices, especially IoT devices, in your own infrastructure that will be used as part of the denial of service attack on the target, right? So we're seeing a lack of or an impact to availability of those IoT devices that are being used to target the victim. So that can also affect business as usual for organizations that aren't even in election land.
Right.
And then the other way that we could go about it is if you are in the city, right, that is running polling stations, these IoT devices can be used to either corrupt data, delete data, or create a denial of service onto either the networks or the systems, right, such as the voter registration that's going to be at the polling station, or the collection system that's going to be in the, data center of the city. So even though, so we sort of have these external denial of service, but we also have internal denial of service, as well as, attacks that may be motivated to delete or corrupt data.
Yeah.
So we're really seeing it from all sides, whether or not you are in the election infrastructure directly or not. So again, we're sort of all in this together.
For sure. And it's also that mixture. You got some fixed sites with, actual cable and maybe a cellular backup. You're going to have, temporary sites that probably have a cellular setup and some sort of infrastructure. And then you're just going to have these pop-up locations, that, are just kind of getting the data or even broadcasting, sending data elsewhere. So kind of, like a lot of different entities from fixed to just, a little pop-up station.
Yeah, and in this diagram, you can see how the city infrastructure is going across a cellular connection. And so in this case, right, Cradlepoint is a cellular connectivity company with lots of security included. if you saturate that link, not only do you have a denial of service, you have a big bill,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
that's a lot of money. So if you don't have rate limiting set, whether it's on a cellular connection or otherwise, you don't have rate limiting set, you can find yourself with a very big bill at the end of the month because your device was used as part of a denial of service attack.
True that.
Yes, yes, yes. So in the resources link, you will see that there is a link to the CISA documents that talks about the hacktivists, that talks about the types of living off the land techniques that we've seen from, say, Volt Typhoon, which is one of the largest creators of botnets out on the internet. They were shut down, but we have seen that these shutdown activities by governments have not been as effective as we would want them to. Sort of hackers are learning and adapting as per usual, and so have been able to stay online more than we expected after a takedown. So the CISA reports have a lot of information about who, what techniques, and sort of profiling the threat actors that they expect to be involved in these kinds of attacks around the election. So I
Yeah.
would definitely recommend reading those.
Weekly hot shots where we give you tactical threat intelligence every week. And as always, we do it with our senior threat intelligence analyst, Alex Ryan. What's happening, Alex?
Hey, not much, Peter. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Always good to see you every week. As we
Thanks.
say each and every week, let's get to it.
That's right. Okay. So every month, our team puts out a monthly threat intelligence report, and I just wanted to let our audience know about that report. Here is sort of the at a glance view, and we are going to cover some of those same topics here in our presentation today. So, there's the link to the full report, and it'll be in the description. So go ahead and download that, and certainly welcome your feedback and thoughts on the content of that. But we are going to focus today on sort of info stealers, social engineering lures, and then we're going to talk about some PowerShell developments. Especially, we'll sort of use Black Basta as our showcase, but definitely seeing more malware that's using scripting language, especially PowerShell. So that's the highlights. So let's get going. All right. So new social engineering lures. What is this? So in the past month, and so this would be July, because our August report covers the period of July. These are new social engineering campaigns that we saw, and the lures that they use to get users to download and run. I don't know, like malicious PowerShell scripts that you can see with this fake IT support site. What's really interesting about these is that, as you can see with that second one on the list, they create dedicated websites, they create promotional videos, user reviews, and the user reviews are from accounts that are aged and have access to or have posted other reviews. So they've certainly the threat actors have done their due diligence to make those look legitimate. So again, we're just seeing this evolution of added techniques for legitimacy around these kinds of lures. So again, as our users are being subjected to more sophisticated lures, and as more data is lost, which can target our users to make these lures look more legitimate, the more difficult it is for them to tell what is legitimate or not. And interestingly, it just so happened that a couple days ago, Linus Sebastian, who runs the Twitter account of Linus Tech Tips, was phished. And they installed a info stealer, and they took the credentials of his or of the account for Linus Tech Tips on Twitter and hijacked that account. And so this is an intensely technological person, right? He was distracted. He was at a family barbecue, and he just clicked on the link and wasn't really thinking about it. And literally, that's all it takes. You just have to be distracted. I mean, I almost feel like this should be like a public service campaign, like, don't drink and drive, right? Don't click links when distracted. or like don't click on links when you've been, drinking or something. I mean, just it's crazy, a little crazy.
Yeah, one of those the more you know kinds of PSAs. And I think you know this, right? 70% of the new domains being registered are being used for malicious purposes. So it's the threat actors that are registering the majority of new domains. And I mean, Tech Tips has been around forever, a long time. That's
Long
nuts.
time. And the other part of that is that when you're talking about so many domains being registered, very good looking replications of, big name brands are being created right now. And I think it may be in preparation for the US holiday shopping spree that we're about to go into, right? Everybody's about to go into high gear for shopping for the holidays. And I really think that those domains are really targeting campaigns that we'll see around that season.
Oh yeah, I'm for sure. And then I also see what is that, the fourth or fifth one down, kind of jumping on the CrowdStrike bandwagon, luring people like, oh, it's an easy fix. Click here.
The speed at which attackers were able to leverage this was phenomenal. Like within hours, like within 12 hours, these kinds of lures and calls were out there. So again, just seeing this ability to leverage technology very quickly.
Yeah, and with AI, they say, we might have brought this up before, that now neither humans nor AI can tell the difference between an AI generated phishing, what have you, or a human generated one.
Yeah, let's burn it to the ground, Peter.
Okay.
Just kidding.
Next slide then.
Okay, next one.
Black Basta's back again.
Yes, Black Basta. So we covered them in our Q3 threat intelligence report. We put out a quarterly report and we reviewed Black Basta because CISA had put out sort of a stop ransomware report on Black Basta in the previous quarter. And so here they are again, so proving that CISA knows what they're talking about. What we're seeing here is Black Basta potentially investing in custom malware. So in the past, they have leveraged what we would call commercial or highly available ransomware tools and other kinds of tools in their toolkit across the attack lifecycle, right? So obviously there's Black Basta ransomware as a service for the ransomware, but all of the other malware along the steps of the attack lifecycle, those are all different and can be upgraded and used in different ways. So what Walmart saw in this attack was PowerShell being used during the attack lifecycle with tools that are very common for Black Basta. So that's kind of how they tied together this PowerShell script and Black Basta, is because of that full toolkit that they saw. And so this is also a trend that we're seeing. So not only sort of a big threat actor investing in a custom malware, but also the use of PowerShell. So what I would like to emphasize here is really look at the common commands that a threat actor will use in PowerShell for reconnaissance. That's going to be who am I, my IP address, doing a netstat, just the typical reconnaissance commands that we've seen for many years. So those hard-coded commands are still being used, but how it's delivered and how the data gets back out is becoming more sophisticated. So one of the ways to detect this increasing use of scripting language, and specifically PowerShell, is to look for those commands.
Yeah, they got their own R&D departments now, don't they? Their whole, crew.
It's the upside down world, right? I'm sure that they have group
back.
emails and group meetings, and the developers are like, oh my God, not in the meeting. So I'm sure it's the same.
Crazy.
Okay. So speaking of stealers and loaders, right? So we saw Linus Tech Tips being attacked and hijacked using an info stealer. And we saw our social lures are getting more sophisticated. So continuing in that trend, we're seeing that our info stealers and loaders are also becoming more of them, but also becoming more sophisticated. So these are new info stealers and loaders that were observed in July, right? So we've got 5 of them, and there were probably more, right? But at least 5 of these guys that came into the ecosystem and have been observed during attacks. So the point of this slide, right, not only for you to go and look at these particular malwares, but to say this is continuing and will increase the attacks using loaders and stealers. So please think about where in your defenses you can increase your protection for your users and for your infrastructure in case your user is at a barbecue, gets distracted, and clicks on a bad link.
Yeah, and I think we covered jellyfish just a couple 2-3 episodes ago, didn't we?
Yes, in July.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, yeah, duh.
yeah. There was
Considering
that one episode, and I was like, "This is just a hot mess. I'm just gonna throw it all on there and let's hope for the best." So, yeah,
fascinating. Wow.
that's it.
Crazy stuff this week. Holy cow. Things to take notice every week.
Yes.
Tactical threat intelligence, actionable content, threat intelligence hot shots, where we give you tactical advice to the current threats in the industry. And as always, we have our senior threat intelligence analyst, Alex Ryan, with us. How's it going, Alex? Good to see you.
Going great. Good to see you too.
Now, today, or this week's, I should say, is right up our alley, I believe, since we're talking a bit about 5G. So let's take it away.
Absolutely. So we had some really great presentations at Black Hat in August. And so one of the talks that was in Black Hat that I wanted to chat about because it was 5G specific. And I thought, what a great opportunity for us to dive into some very specific 5G vulnerabilities. And when I say 5G vulnerabilities, actually, it's how other devices interact with 5G where we actually see the vulnerabilities. So we'll get into that a little bit, but I thought it was a great opportunity to understand how do end user devices and the 5G cores, network cores, work together to get your signal across.
Beautiful.
Okay.
And the rest, including
And the rest,
takeaways.
yeah. So a big thing is we have to understand the hardware, like how is this even working? And of course, we're all again the eternal question: what about Stingray? So we're gonna talk about that. And then we had some patches that came out in December, sort of a collection of them that had the nickname of 5Ghoul. Is this the same thing as that? Yes or no? And then some takeaways on how you can protect you and your infrastructure from these vulnerabilities.
We always give some mitigation.
Yes, it's our job. Okay. And we love to, right? Please stay secure.
Yeah.
So, in summary, the security researchers from Penn State developed a piece of hardware that can test cellular hardware for known vulnerabilities. So, a modem and a end user like a cell phone, both of them have something in them called a baseband processor. And this baseband processor, which is just called baseband, the baseband has its own processor and chip and memory, and it's completely separate from the rest of the modem or smartphone, what they call the application layer. So this is a very self-contained kind of hardware set on a modem or a cellular device. So what these folks developed was a piece of hardware you can test all of your cellular devices, whether it's a modem or a cell phone, for these kinds of vulnerabilities. And up to this point, we've been pretty blind about vulnerabilities that were in the baseband. So now being able to use the software that they developed, as well as putting it on like a Raspberry Pi or something like that, you can test for those vulnerabilities and be aware. So one of the things that they bring up in their talk, though, is a known weakness in an authentication process that happens between a cell tower and a cellular device. And I'm just going to say smartphone here, okay? So between the smartphone and the tower, what the authentication happens is the cell phone says to the tower, hey, I want to authenticate. And the tower says, excellent. There is no time where the tower says back to the cell phone, oh, yes, I'm legitimate. So there's no requirement that that tower authenticate to that cell phone. And what this creates is an opportunity for threat actors to create a rogue tower that says, hey, connect to me. And the cell phone dutifully connects and authenticates. Tower says, oh yeah, that's great. But because the tower never has to authenticate back, cell phone doesn't know that it has connected to a tower run by a bad actor. And that allows an actor to mimic a cellular base station. So that's the weakness that they exploit to create extended attacks, which we'll talk about just a minute. All right, so how does this work? So when the baseband microprocessor has a vulnerability, the threat actor has to do a bit of work to get to the point where they can exploit those vulnerabilities. First, they need a base station, a rogue base station. Second is they have to somehow boost their signal so that it will lure the victim device to connect to it. Mm-hmm. That means they have to be in the geographical area, right? So we do have some pretty high level limit, barriers to entry on this attack.
Criteria.
Yeah, that's what they need to do. But once the victim device is connected to the rogue tower, the threat actor will then send traffic through the rogue tower that says, exploits the vulnerability, right? Just runs exploit code against that baseband vulnerability. So it exploits that vulnerability. And what that vulnerability allows is eavesdropping of encrypted traffic. So even if you are running on HTTPS on your browser, when it goes through the rogue tower, it will be in clear. It will. The rogue tower can always also be used to send malicious SMS messages to the cell phone, which does think that they're legitimate, as well as redirecting traffic to malicious websites. So some pretty bad stuff that can happen from connecting to this rogue tower and then the rogue tower being used to exploit the baseband vulnerabilities.
So this is classic man in the middle, but applied to cellular devices.
100%. Yes. And what you're looking at here, this is not a 5G protocol issue. This isn't a telco equipment issue, right? This is an authentication between the end user device and the cellular tower. So that's where that vulnerability is living.
Right. And with the phone unable to verify the tower back, that's all bets are off.
That's the weakness. Yes.
Yeah. Wow.
Okay, so the next question is, we're all very familiar with Stingray. So is this a Stingray? Well, yes, actually it is, but it isn't. So Stingray cannot be used on a 5G router or a 5G signal. It's only 4G and lower. And so for that reason, it's not the same. But on the other hand, it is the same because it's a man in the middle. It's a rogue tower, except it's being used by authorities to gather information. So that's how it's different. It's a man in the middle, but it's the good guys doing it.
Yeah. A man in the middle attack with a warrant attached. Hopefully.
Correct. Always. Yes. Okay. And so then we ask the question again, well, wait a minute, what about 5Ghoul that came out in December? Is this the same thing? You're getting used to this image by now, aren't you? Because it's a man in the middle attack. But in this case, the impact that a threat actor can have on that cellular device is only such that they could freeze or reboot the cellular device, or they could do something called a downgrade attack. And I found that to be the most worrisome part of these 5Ghoul vulnerabilities, is that you can tell a cellular, or you can negotiate with a cellular device such that it will go to a 5G protocol that is weaker.
Is Puppy chewing on something?
What's that?
Is Puppy chewing on something?
I mean, seriously. He's better
now.
Good. Yes. So what happens is Go on, get lost. Go. Go, go, go. Go away. All right. Right. Take two. So what about 5GUL? Is 5GUL the same as Stingray and, the authentication bypass? How does that play into sort of this field of vulnerabilities that we're having conversations about? And as you'll see, why, yes, it is a man-in-the-middle attack. The difference with the 5GUL vulnerabilities that were published is that they were the same in that the vulnerability is in the baseband, but it's different because when you exploited those vulnerabilities, the impact was that the device would freeze or reboot. So it would impact your business operations uptime. But then it would also allow a downgrade attack. And that's where the cellular device and the tower negotiate down to a lower version of cellular connectivity. So from 5G to 4G. And there are some vulnerabilities in 4G that can then be exploited. So that's what the threat actor is wanting, saying 5G is too secure. I can't attack on that. Hey, let's move down to 4G because I've got some exploits for that. So for me, the 5GUL, the downgrade attack was really the most worrisome part of those vulnerabilities that were published.
Now, these man-in-the-middle attacks, right? They just, maybe, the device freezes, but in general, it's just the messages going back and forth, right? It's not as if they can then harvest contacts off the phone. And then a second question, could they maybe use, I guess this would be the authorities, use this to downgrade the signal to then use the Stingray to then intercept? You know where I'm driving at with this, right?
You're 100% correct. Yes.
Oh, okay.
I see why you work in a security company.
Interesting.
Well, no, wait. You have to go back to your first question. Can they harvest contacts, right?
Yeah.
The baseband is completely separate from any kind of application that is running on the router. And the router is completely separate from anything that's running on the phone. So no, could you get to an application layer access of a smartphone that is connected to the modem? No, not through a baseband exploit.
Okay. Just the signal and the traffic.
Exactly. All right, so here's some takeaways. So what do you do with all of this information? How do we action this? So just understand the different categories of attacks. What's the authentication bypass, Stingray, 5GUL? So we just followed that. Check out the software that was published by the Penn State security researchers who presented the information at Black Hat. Really great stuff. Give that a try. In your threat feeds, and when I say threat feeds, I mean just your Google News alerts, man. So it doesn't have to be fancy to be threat intelligence. Right. Look for cellular-related vulnerabilities. You also need to be aware that there is a window of risk between when these vulnerabilities are published and firmware is released by the vendor to resolve the vulnerability, and when your cell phone service will package it into a firmware update and send it to your phone. So there is some lag there. So just be aware of that exposure. One thing that you can do to limit that exposure is to not allow downgrade attacks, which is to say on your cellular device, you can say, I'll only use 5G. And then make sure that you keep your firmware up to date on the updates from your provider, because it may well patch one of these kinds of vulnerabilities.
And if you're new to the cellular lingo, 4G is just LTE in the speaking world.
All
And
right.
always the sources. So the
Always
one
the
thing too, I I had added the PDF of their presentation. These are PhD students that are presenting this material, which kind of, gives me hope that the younger generations coming in that are, engineering this stuff are going to keep and help make it all secure as we get to like the 6Gs, 7Gs, 14G. Hopefully it's, really locked down tight. And by then, hopefully the towers will be, or the phones, I should say, asking for verification of the tower also.
Absolutely.
Threat intelligence hot shots, where we give you tactical threat intelligence every week with our threat intelligence team. And joining me once again is Alex Ryan, our senior threat intelligence analyst. I butchered that title at least a handful of times, but I know I got it straight the last couple. How's it going, Alex?
It's going great. I don't know what I do here either. Just lots of fun, keeping people safe. That's what it really is.
Well, then let's get to it for this week's hot shots. What do we got?
All right. So I have to say that, the last week and a half in sort of the cyber threat landscape has been wild. Now, I know that I've been saying this, right? Saying, oh, it's a hot mess out there. Well, it is, and even more. So in the past week, we've seen Halliburton have a possible ransomware attack, Port of Seattle, SeaTac, so the airport have an attack, some real critical infrastructure attacks that have had impacts. We don't know who the threat actors were. We don't know what kind of ransomware, so we'll be looking for those kind of details to report out next time. But we also had an attack, successful attack on AMD, which is a chip microprocessor manufacturing company, and these chips go into hundreds of thousands, millions of devices. And so there was an attack on AMD, and this was actually the second attack that has happened to them in the past, 3 months. So of all of the stories that we have coming out, I really wanted to focus on one because it can become very overwhelming to get all of this news and then to know how to take action in relation to an attack that has happened. So I wanted to take the AMD attack and really break that down and figure out what kind of attacks could we see in the future based off of this attack.
Yeah, so instead of a hot mess, it's been the summer of mess.
Yes. Yes, it's like put your bib on at the crab shack, it's just a mess. So, talking about this AMD attack. So, I'd like you to notice at the bottom of the slide. In June, they were attacked and they were compromised by a threat actor called Intel Broker. Now, Intel Broker is an interesting threat actor because he tends to collaborate with other threat actors, which is kind of different, and uses the malware tools and techniques in a combination with whoever he is collaborating with. This makes it really difficult to sort of attribute to Intel Broker certain attacks unless he comes out and says what kind of attack he's been responsible for. And he's been responsible for a lot, Zscaler, Apple, Interpol. I mean, just a lot of very high profile victims. So in this case with AMD, when he infiltrated their environment, he exfiltrated source code, firmware, and future AMD products. Now, also financial documents and customer and employee information, which is no small thing. But the fact that they lost source code and firmware, very significant. So if I were a threat actor, I would take a look at that firmware and begin to reverse engineer it to see what kind of vulnerabilities might already be in there that I could take advantage of on a firmware basis.
Yeah.
Then you'll notice that on August 9th, there was a CPU vulnerability that AMD reported that's called sync close, which actually would allow actors to install virtually undetectable malware on those microprocessors. So why is that so important? When you install something at a microprocessor layer, none of your security controls are online when you boot your system at the very beginning, right?
Mhm.
Your microprocessor comes up, your BIOS comes up, and then your operating system starts to load. And so the microprocessor and BIOS is executing before your security controls have come online to protect you. So it's very difficult to protect yourself from a firmware attack. So
Yeah, and
we see the vulnerability come out.
we've kinda talked about that before when something gets in the kernel and it's in the boot process, then the EDR systems aren't able to detect it.
Yes, that's right. And interestingly, that's exactly what happened with this vulnerability, the sync close. Um, there is a process in kernel 0, which is your most trusted, hooks into the microprocessor and the hardware, and it is able to escalate out to what they call ring 2, which would allow them to install malware and do, other kinds of activities. So exactly what you're saying, right? Some significant vulnerabilities in the kernel level.
Yeah.
Okay. And then, right, in August, just recently, just last week, this week, real soon, there was another attack where user credentials and, really interestingly, case numbers and descriptions of support cases were taken. Now, why is that got me sort of riled up? If you'll remember, last year, there was a successful compromise using an authentication token that was taken from a technical support system. A customer had uploaded their debug logs. It had the authentication token in them. The threat
Yeah.
actor took the authentication token and used it to breach the other company. So when we say, case numbers and descriptions, we're like, yeah, but we saw that actually be really well weaponized in the past. So now that is a significant loss of data. So AMD has definitely, sort of in a vulnerable spot right now. And so we're wondering, what are threat actors going to do with this information?
The holiday shopping season's coming up.
I guess they need some spending money. All right, so if we go to the next slide. So we've seen this slide before in previous hotshot videos, and this is a conceptual idea of when data is stolen, where does it go? Because you can sort of think, oh, the one threat actor who stole it does this one thing with it. And, they sell it to one threat actor who has one motivation, and it's just not true. So as you can see from this graph, you can take the credentials that were stolen and you would sell it to an initial access broker. You could take information if it's sensitive enough and extort either the corporation through ransomware, right? Or individuals. So you can see a lot of different paths through a lot of different threat actors who are all working in the same time frame with the same data. So you can see that this is very expansive. The one that I'd like to focus on for AMD is the corporate espionage. So you can sell this proprietary information to competitors. You can also sell it to governments who may have malicious intent. And governments, what we call state-sponsored actors,
Yeah.
really play the long game. And firmware can definitely be a long game play where you sit silently until the time that you want to disrupt operations has turned up in your plan. So I would guess that a lot of the AMD information will go into corporate espionage and state-sponsored threat actors.
Wow.
Yeah. So if we talk about, okay, so if I were a threat actor, what would I do? I would take the firmware that has been stolen, I would reverse engineer it, and I would look for pre-existing vulnerabilities. I would
Right.
also figure out how to put my own malware into that. So sort of a little bit of preparation. Now I've got the credentials to go back into the company's system. And now I know where where the information is stored, the source code, right? And I have the credentials. I would modify the firmware with my malicious code in it. And then I would wait for that to be spread out, across the world. So I know that sounds diabolical and a very complicated attack chain, but it has happened in the last 2 years. Supply chain attacks so often, it's no longer a far-fetched idea.
Yeah,
So
you get more bang for the breach.
nice. And so one of the things that is a little bit misleading is that when we have firmware vulnerabilities come out, they're actually given a low CVSS score, which is sort of the scoring system that we use to figure out how critical a vulnerability is. It's fairly reduced because the model that creates the score assumes that you have to have physical access to the machine to download this, malware to the, processor. And that's not the case. When it's a third party, right, it's coming to your house already preloaded. They don't need physical access. They've affected it too far up the manufacturing chain.
Right.
So those CVSS scores can be quite misleading. So we saw firmware attacks in the past. Meltdown Inspector had huge impacts. We had Cosmic Strand. This was interesting, an infected motherboard firmware that went out. Luckily, it didn't have too much of an impact. It wasn't on too many of the manufactured boards, but it's just a case in point that this can be done. And then Black Lotus, the boot kit that was found in 2023, was being sold on breached forums for about $5,000. And so this was definitely your very typical boot kit where all of the operating system mechanisms for security were offline before the malware could run, before those controls could come online. So the firmware tactics, tried, true, and as you can see, they're current. They've been in the past, they're current, and they're going to be in the future. So I would say that with that trend of them being successful and established for firmware attacks, plus the AMD attacks that we've seen and the loss of data, loss of credentials, I would say it is likely that we will see additional firmware attacks in the future.
And Meltdown Inspector, I believe, even had their own little logo, the logos and designs that they tie to some of these vulnerabilities. But defense in depth, obviously, multiple
Yes,
layers
defense
of
in depth.
protection.
So that's all the bad news. Let's talk about the good news. So how would you defend yourself against this firmware? It sounds pretty awful, right? Everything, none of your security controls are online, initiating malware. So what I would talk about is definitely keep your firmware upgraded at scale. Now, in the past, this has been quite difficult because we had to physically touch the computer in order to boot to the BIOS update and things like that. That's no longer the case. So hardware vendors, chip manufacturers, and then us using more sophisticated scripts are now better able to update firmware at scale. So definitely look at how your own disaster recovery or incident response plan would respond to a firmware infection. So that's sort of your proactive defense. And then containment. When that malware runs, it is going to do two things. It wants to establish persistence, and then it wants to escalate privileges. Now, you have got to put in some kind of containment. So you can't stop it being on your machine. It's already there. But you can absolutely stop it from looking for privilege escalation, other accounts moving across, moving laterally, those kinds of things. Put in zero trust network access. You've got to limit the impact that this threat actor will have in your environment. If possible, don't give any network access to your devices and only use name-based resources or name-based routing so that there's no network scanning. There's no, sniffing the network for credentials as they go across and curb roasting and things like that. So using zero trust really reduces the threat actor's ability to move. And threat actors are just like us. They have a set of toolkits that they use over and over again. And if you create an environment where their toolkit doesn't work, they're going to have a lot less impact than they could otherwise. And then if you are using name-based routing to applications, web-based applications, you can use web application isolation to limit the pages that users can access, like administration pages, any kind of cross-site scripting, things like that. And then also stop file uploads and downloads depending on how you want your user to use that application. So puts a really good defense in place.
Yep.
And then the last thing, right, once your threat actor is trying to expand, they're going to bump up against your access controls and create denies in your logs. So just keep an eye out for that. That's typical, right? That's what we do in our monitoring. But just consider that this firmware, when you're doing your investigation, it may come from the inside. So when you're looking for your initial access, it might not be there. It might just have shown up in your hardware.
Yeah, and they kind of work off an ROI too, right? If they starting to get, if you're just putting up these little blocks and they get frustrated and it costs them more to keep trying to attack, they'll probably end up, screw it, I'll go on to an easier target.
Yeah, actually, they'll sell that access to another threat actor if they kind of get stuck. They'll, but that takes time, and that gives you the ability to detect it, right? It gives you some time to do it. So just some big takeaways here. I think firmware attacks may be in our future. Look for persistence and privilege escalation that comes out of literally nowhere. That'll give you a hint. This might be firmware. And then take a look at Intel Broker. Just do some research. Do you think that you would be a target for his kind of, previous pattern of hits? Would you be in his scope of attacks profile?
Sure.
Yeah.
Got to keep all the tentacles out from various entities. As always, we have our sources. We'll include these. Threat intelligence hotshots, where we give you actionable and tactical. Let me start again in 3. Aloha. You're watching Ericsson Enterprise Wireless Weekly Threat Intelligence Hotshots, where we give you actionable and tactical threat intelligence information. I am Peter, and as always, I'm joined every week by our senior threat intelligence analyst, Alex Ryan. Good to see you, Alex.
Hey, great to see you.
Episode, what are we, 18? We're up to 18 now. Pretty cool.
Awesome.
We're going to be busting out some champagne in 22 episodes. Why don't we get to it? Hot Shots, presented by the Threat Intelligence and Research and Analysis Team. What do we got this week?
Yeah, so this week, we had a lot going on in the threat landscape, but there was something that came up that I really wanted to sort of take a deep dive on, because it was a very small thing that came up, but the implications are quite large. So I really wanted to dive into it. And what came into the news story was about Yubico has a YubiKey, which is a hard token that is used for authentication. So when you talk about multi-factor authentication, you can have soft tokens, you can have passwords and text codes and things like that. And the YubiKey is a hardware token. So that hardware token has a microprocessor on it. That microprocessor has an encryption library on it. And that encryption library has a flaw.
Wow.
Now, researchers were able to use that flaw in that library to clone the device. So the researchers said it took them a couple of minutes with the device online. With offline, it took them about 24 hours, but they said that with some optimization, they could make that attack much faster. So this is quite a large break in the YubiKeys. Now, YubiKey, their whole system, there are additional ways that you need to authenticate. So what happened was their ranking of their vulnerability was a little lower. And so we'll go into that in a minute. But being able to clone a device is quite significant.
And now,
yep.
So with that, like I got a slew of them. So what is this one? This is an old one. can't remember who makes it, OTP C100. The little thing, you hit the button and, a secondary number, the multi-factor number, the two-factor.
Exactly.
And then I remember last week we were talking about how the how not infections, how they can infiltrate the kernel, the boot process, and insert,
Yes.
and then they send them all out, and then it's from manufacturing, not something that happens online. So does it impact those that are already in folks' hands, or it's one of those, or they could probably take this and do the same thing, right?
It depends on what microprocessor you have on that device.
Got it.
And this is exactly the point. We now have to start thinking about, what's the microprocessor on my authentication device? I don't know, Peter. You'll have to go and look that up. So it's kind of crazy. And so in this case, all of the YubiKeys are affected, like everyone in existence, I believe, is
Wow.
impacted by this. But this particular microprocessor is made from Infineon, and it is used in many other devices. So this was sort of like just the tip of the iceberg, right? Ubicon has a problem. Oh no, big name, lots of impact, lots of people are upset, right? But then you take a step back and you say, well, where else is this microprocessor used? So what other devices might be vulnerable? IoT devices, banking smart cards, electronic passports, right? That is sort of underneath, that's the iceberg underneath the water. And so I wanted to talk a little bit more about this particular microprocessor. So if you want to go to the next slide,
Sure.
we're not picking on Infineon because, as you can see in the history, this has happened with other manufacturers as well. So rather, this is just an example of diving in deeper to understand how a microprocessor vulnerability can impact more devices than we realize. So the IoT devices that are secured with this microprocessor, and I actually took this right off of the Infineon website. So the data that is coming from IoT devices, this is a use case, that are coming from IoT devices that use this microprocessor, that data is authenticated and given a high level of integrity when it's received at the other side, and then people take action on that information. So if the data is corrupted or no longer has integrity because the device has been cloned and then replaces the device that was actually the legitimate device, right? That integrity is gone because that device has been cloned. Now the data that you're getting has no integrity. And so let's talk about that data, that impact from the data not having integrity. So IoT devices are used in a lot of critical infrastructure, financial services, business models that are driven by sort of just-in-time types of manufacturing, those kinds of things. So that data being incorrect going into business decisions and into manufacturing can have really significant impacts.
Right,
So,
because it's not it's not just that individual's access through a compromised token. It can then impact all of the various entities within their system.
yes, absolutely. So, in my mind, one of the things though is when you clone this device, so yeah, you've got a data integrity problem depending on your use case. But in the more common use case, you're going to have a network breach, right? Someone clones a device, it gets onto the network, it's authenticated because it looks exactly the same. It's using the same encryption algorithms that are expected and probably will have access, right, to your network. And so one of the things that Cradlepoint does when we talk about IoT deployment is that with the 5G SIM, that SIM card becomes a root of trust as well. So if somebody cloned, an IoT device behind a Cradlepoint router, we would be able to tell that it was a clone.
Oh,
Yes. So there's, especially if the SIM card is in the IoT device itself, say you've got a hand scanner or you use tools that are on the manufacturing line that have connections back to larger corporate applications, that that SIM card is protected by, or that device is protected by having the root of trust from the SIM card. So
Cool.
Cradlepoint using 5G really brings another level of security to these devices.
Wow. That's so cool. I had no idea about that. That's
Yeah.
I was today years old when I learned about that.
All right. Right. So, how are we going to protect ourselves from these microprocessors? Because we really have two problems, right? The first one is, how do I know that it's even in my environment, right? At that point, we start talking about supply chain management, right? Hardware bill of materials. And I can tell you that efficacy of tracking everything, every bit and byte that is in your environment is going to be very difficult unless you're the government. So having supply chain management is going to be a heavy lift. So the better way to really defend from these is defense in depth. And one of the most effective ways to defend against, sort of limit the impact of an attack and defend against other devices becoming infected, is using ZTNA, right? So
Yep.
you really pinhole the amount of access that that device has to your network, so that if it is compromised and it is cloned and it comes onto your network, its ability to compromise your network is incredibly small as compared to without ZTNA.
Right. And then even more so dwindle down how many actual users with one of these can access that device.
Right. Right. So yeah, so that was what I wanted to talk about today, is how a story that I kind of thought, well, that's interesting, but it doesn't impact me. And then I started reading into it, and then I saw from the researchers saying that it affected these other microprocessors. Where are they used? Oh, they're used in a bunch of stuff. So this story sort of built in my threat landscape to understand it wasn't just this one use case with YubiKey.
Alex likes to follow the threat breadcrumbs to get right to the Hansel and Gretel house.
Yeah, I follow the rabbit, that's for sure. And we've got some great sources for you. Very interesting. So Ninja Labs were the ones who wrote or found this vulnerability, and they wrote like an 87-page document talking about how they did this and the impacts and all these kinds of things. So very thorough research and definitely worth a read. And then Yubico came back and said, well, because of the physical access required, we're going to rate this as a low risk. Yubico said, it's a moderate risk. And then the CVSS score is 4.9, which I think is low. And because they said, it requires physical access, but IoT devices are everywhere, right? We're not like IoT device that's in a data center that's, restricted inside a building that has locked doors, right? IoT devices like are in the middle of nowhere, traffic intersections, right?
Yep.
EV charging stations, they're really physically vulnerable. So from our perspective, the vulnerability or the criticality of the vulnerability is higher because physical access is not a problem.
Yeah. Wow. Threat intelligence hotshots, where we give you tactical threat intelligence information every week. Who do we do it with? We always do it with Alex Ryan, our senior threat intelligence analyst. How's it going, Alex?
Yeah, doing great. Thanks.
Excellent. I try to come up with something new and exciting each time I introduce you, but I know you got some exciting ransom stuff going for hotshots this week, don't you?
Yeah, we sure do. We've got some big movement in threat landscape that we'd like to review. Yeah. All right. So let's kick it off with Ransom Hub, which has been, they sort of came into being in March of this year, and they were obviously a very mature cyber gang based on how quickly they brought up their infrastructure, how quickly they had affiliates move over to them. So obviously already had relationships built and an alliance and those kinds of things. So, as would be expected, we have seen them come out of the gate really quickly as far as number of attacks, and we have them increasing this month. Actually, in August, Checkpoint reported that they had the highest number of ransomware attacks, and we're even seeing more affiliates moving over to Ransom Hub, which is both a threat actor but also a ransomware as a service group. So these affiliates are moving over to use the Ransom Hub ransomware, and more of them are moving out. So we can just expect that we're going to see more Ransom Hub ransomware in the future. It is Lockbit 3. It's a derivative of that. So if you are looking for IOCs, definitely check out the CISA report that was put out in September called Stop Ransomware Advisory for Ransom Hub. Lots of IOCs in there, so make sure that you check your defenses and just make sure that you would be able to catch these IOCs in the attack life cycle. And, when we're looking at threat intelligence as an analyst and we're trying to figure out, sort of trying to cut through the noise and figure out what's important to me to defend my organization, right? We definitely look at, am I a target? Is my industry a target? Is my IP a target? Is it political target? So in this case with Ransom Hub, we're really seeing critical infrastructure in the last month or so really be a target that they are moving towards. So if you're in critical infrastructure, Ransom Hub should start building up as a higher priority, as a risk in your analysis. So their initial access is really dependent on the affiliate's expertise, right? Since it's a RAS, affiliates take it, and the affiliates do the initial access. And then they use the Ransom Hub ransomware to infect machines and encrypt them, those kinds of things. So depending on the affiliate is going to define what kind of initial access techniques. But let's just say that we take the most successful techniques of the day right now, which is stealing or buying stolen credentials and then using social engineering to get into folks' environments. So those are the top two.
And it's kind of like, I was almost going to say a studio or a network, but they own the platform and the distribution of the content.
Yeah, they sure do.
Wow.
Meow. All right. So I know. And there seems to be a meme somewhere out there that says, you didn't just meow me. I have no idea what this meme is. Go check it out. Apparently, it's very funny. I've been told. Very funny.
I'll have to check it out.
Yeah. Anyway, so we don't know much about this Meow group. They have their own ransomware, but it is a Conti derivative. And all of a sudden, they came out of nowhere. They've been around since 2022. Kind of went quiet for a while, but now really came back and is like the second most successful ransomware in August. I mean, what? So we don't know sort of we don't know a lot of them, like their origins and things like that. But what we have seen is that they're targeting healthcare, manufacturing, and especially academic research. So we could make some extrapolations based on what it is that they're targeting, but we really don't know at this point. But what we have seen for their initial access is RDP, phishing with attachments, and then malicious adverts, with search engine optimization and deceptive downloads. So not a big shock. We've seen this initial access, but their ransomware is kind of custom. So you do want to do some research on these guys and, look at their IOCs. They do a different kind of extortion. They don't encrypt your data and then exfiltrate it and then extort you for that data, which is called double extortion. These guys just do single extortion. So they take the data out of your environment. They don't encrypt stuff, but then they say, hey, we'll sell the data to you and not sell it to somebody else, or we'll just
Mm,
sell it to somebody else. So, depending on what the organization wants to do, they're going to sell the data to somebody. Is
either
it going
way.
to be you or somebody else? So, that is their extortion scheme.
So on the last one, so we got Lockbit version 3 derivative and here Conti version 2 derivative.
Mhm.
Um, is there nuances or it just they got a hold of the version 1 and then kind of expanded it or made it better from there, R&D?
Yeah, absolutely. So what happens is these, especially encryptors are hard to write. So what happens is as ransomware versions, which contain those in the encryption code, right? As those versions sort of progress over time, sometimes the older version, the source code is leaked or sold
Oh,
and then shared around. And
yeah.
so, what threat actors do is they take this older ransomware and they build onto it, especially as new technology or new techniques come out about how to infect a machine with ransomware. And then they use that encryptor, which is, as I said, the hardest bit. So that's why
Got it.
you see
Okay.
derivatives.
Interesting. I
All
know a
right.
lot of people are afraid of spiders, so
So they should be. So Scattered Spider, what we're seeing with them, they're an established and very successful threat actor group. I would say almost number one, although Ransom Hub is giving them a run for their money. They are developing custom malware and they're updating it fairly frequently, which is making it difficult for us to track the IOCs on this. But
mm,
what's really interesting is that they're moving towards cloud native services. So typically, right, they've been attacking data centers, on prem, that kind of stuff, SaaS applications, whatnot. But now they're really looking for cloud native services. And I'll go into a little bit more about what that means in just a moment. And then who are their targets are financial and insurance industries at the moment. And then we are seeing that their initial access techniques are the same, which is
yeah.
social engineering. These guys are so good at social engineering. And they also do SIM swaps, like they used to do SIM swaps, not a whole bunch these days, but they've definitely improved their MFA bypass techniques so that they're able to get past MFA during authentication with the credentials that they've stolen or bought. So,
Nice.
however, I am so excited for the next image. Let me show you.
Okay. Ooh.
Run, don't walk, and check out this graph by Eclectic IQ. So they're a threat intelligence group, and let me tell you this for Scattered Spider, this is a beautiful diagram. So I'm not going to walk you through it because it's a lot. But so when we talk about cloud native services, they're being leveraged during the attack lifecycle. So for during lateral movement, we're seeing AD Explorer, AD Recon, Ping Castle, right? So that's getting as many credentials as you can to try and do lateral movement, privilege escalation, things like that. Now we're seeing, some typical stuff that we do in the past, like remote management tools like, AnyDesk and things like that, but then also cloud specific things like NG, I know it's Grok, Nigrok, no idea. But these are, I'm not a cloud engineer. So these are some of the tools that they are using that are native to the cloud. So we need to start setting alerts and security profiles in our cloud instances to catch these kinds of techniques. Brilliant image. So yeah,
Yeah,
yay
detailed
to
too.
Eclectic IQ.
Wow. Cool stuff.
And these are just our sources.
Our
So go check
sources.
them out. Yep. Read the source, go down the rabbit hole. And I think that you'll be really happy that you did. Great information.
Fascinating. When you're talking social engineering, recently I saw one and this is not necessarily social engineering, but they're also so there was social media malvertising campaign promoting fake AI editor website to then do credential theft. And then I saw another one where they got these fake password managers coding tests used to hack Python developers. So they're really like coming from every angle and every, like, anything we connect to, they're coming after. And those specifically, right? Especially like an AI editor. Oh, I want to make a new cat, a meow meme. Let me get this cool tool, and
Yeah.
I'm taken.
You know what? I really have to admire their creativity, and their, dedication to their craft, and it pays well, so I understand, uh, however, is still immoral, so
Absolutely.
please
Still
don't do
a
that.
crime is a crime is a crime.
Indeed.
Where you get tactical information that you can take action on right away. Who do we do it with? We always do it with Alex Ryan, our senior threat intelligence analyst. What's happening, Alex?
Not much, Peter. How you doing?
I know you got a hot shot deck for us this week.
We do.
Oh, Showa. What do we got going?
All right. So, really strong themes in this past week around utilities, water utilities, wastewater utilities, and transportation. So, um, there was a very interesting story put out by Proofpoint Research, really great detail from them, that has been showing a consistent campaign against transport companies. And what's interesting about this particular campaign is that we're seeing big game hunting techniques, but the attribution that Proofpoint is giving to this threat actor group is not sort of a big, mature cybersecurity gang that you would typically see with big game hunting. So, what is big game hunting? That is typically where you have threat actors are going after very large companies. They are slow and low. They use 0 days, very sophisticated. They don't use automated attacks. They use hands-on keyboard to be as quiet as possible. So that's kind of big game hunting techniques. Whereas we typically associate smaller threat actors with sort of the spray and pray kind of techniques, watering holes where you just kind of hope someone comes by and you infect them that way. So what we're seeing is that Proofpoint doesn't think that this is a big game hunting threat actor, but they're using those kinds of techniques. And big game hunting techniques are particularly tailored and well crafted for the organization or the industry that they're going to attack. And that's what we're seeing here is that only a small number of transportation companies, all in the US though, are being attacked, and that they're using language that is very familiar to the business, and that they use malware and lateral movement techniques that target software that is specific to that industry. So all of that tailoring of your attacks and your lures is very new for a non-sophisticated threat actor. That's sort of a not great indicator for us on the defense side, because now we'll have more of these threat actor groups that are not so mature and well funded doing these kinds of really specialized lures that are quite successful.
Wow.
So
I couldn't help but think, so totally off. Well, no, not really off topic. So, Homer Simpson has this one, where he talks about, like, I've been involved in so many get quick rich schemes, but I know with this scheme, I'm going to get rich and quick. And I guess that's what they're doing.
they really are. Yes, we're seeing, as we expected, right? We're seeing an increase in sophistication. Could that be attributed to AI? Could that be attributed to the breakdown of the really big, Lockbit Alpha V earlier in this year? And so we're sort of seeing this fracturing and just real change in the threat landscape. So I think that that's really what we're seeing here is a change that is attributed to those sort of seismic changes in threat actor groups at the beginning of the year.
Yeah.
What's interesting about this one is that it combines a business email compromise, and sorry, I should have spelled that out. That's what BEC is. And then you typically see BEC, those kinds of compromises. The threat actor comes in, hits real quick, gets into the middle of a conversation, gets a wire transfer sent to them, and then they're out. And in this, what we're seeing in the attack chain is that they're actually introducing ransomware or malware into this attack chain as well. So there can be a quick hit with the wire transfer at the beginning, but then we also have a longer term attack lifecycle where they're hanging out and doing more nefarious activity. So how this attack evolved is that we're actually not sure how they initially get in and compromise that email account to get into the middle of the conversation. But we do know that one of the techniques that they use is sending an email invoice attachment that has a redirection link. It looks like it's going to Google Drive, but then there's a shortened link and it takes you somewhere else, which is a new and common technique now. And then it downloads the malware and sort of goes from there. So this is sophisticated. This has multiple stages in the attack lifecycle and is, sort of very specialized and is definitely going after a particular industry. So if you're in the transportation industry, of course, yes, everybody, like really concerned. However, even if you just do business with transportation organizations, since it's an email, right, you guys could be talking and they'll send you a legitimate looking email with an email attachment that looks legitimate. And, it's just that you're doing business with this organization that is being attacked. So just because you're not in transportation, this still applies to all of us.
Yeah, and then I would imagine it's just logistics in general, whether you're just running the trucks, but it's all the different pieces that are involved in transporting goods.
Yes, that's right. Third-party suppliers that are providing a lot of the underpinnings of a transportation company. Yes.
Yeah. Wow.
All right, and our poor utility providers just can't catch a break. I'll tell you what. So Kansas City Water had their water utility attacked. Now, the really good thing was that the impact was low, right? They reverted to manual operation, which has been a fallback that we've seen in many of our water utility attacks up to date. There was some low pressure, but issues to residents, but there was no contamination like we had seen in Florida a couple of years ago. So that's all great. However, we really have our water utility organizations who guide water utilities around cybersecurity just really sounding off, saying, really, 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 this time the bad guys are coming, and they're not wrong. So what we saw is that, in September 18th of this year, CISA puts out more guidance around cybersecurity. September 26th, we've got the Water ISAC, which is a group of people that come together that all work in a particular industry to talk about cybersecurity. So they went ahead and they put out a TLP Amber threat warning against Russian-linked threat actors, activity that they have been seeing. And then 2 days later, the Kansas water utility gets compromised. So, we're seeing it was a spectacular sequence of events, like just very short and abrupt, but it was, all together, and CISA and Water ISAC are definitely giving us really good information when they give us this guidance. And what we saw earlier in this year was that we had about 5 or 6 water utilities that were compromised. In Texas, we were looking at Hale Center, Lockney, North Texas Municipal. We saw the Aquila, Pennsylvania back in November of 2023. So the pace is picking up. They're not kidding. Those folks really are out there. So let's support our utilities and really, whatever we can do to help them with their cybersecurity. DEF CON actually has created a community to help water utilities understand what their attack surface looks like from the outside and maybe from the inside. So maybe you could volunteer for that organization. But if you're in utilities, wastewater, even power, those kinds of things, the risk level is definitely increasing.
For sure. And I mean, you've been talking about this for a number of months, whether it's the water utilities or that whole living off the land piece that
Yes.
you've brought up in the past. Yeah, I think, yeah, all of our utilities are definitely at stake.
And then another really interesting theme that came out this past week was talking about how there is a Russian state-sponsored cyber gang called GRU, and people like CISO or NATO, the FBI, those kinds of things are sort of putting out this language that's talking about signs of reconnaissance that they're seeing that is attributed to this group as a reconnaissance or a precursor to using the kinds of attacks that we've seen in Ukraine. So Russia has been, or GRU has been very active, right, in compromising Ukraine critical infrastructure, whether that's hospitals, power, water, whatever. And now we're seeing that the other organizations in Western Europe and in the US are now starting to expect those kinds of techniques to come against our organizations and our infrastructure. So
we're taking the attacks on the road.
They are, yes. So I think they've sort of honed their skills, and now it's a global tour. So, but what the techniques that we're typically seeing with this threat actor group is that they compromise VPNs, mostly using vulnerabilities. And we've seen a slew of vulnerabilities against VPN and sort of internet-facing networking gear, right, in this year. So it's a pretty big attack surface on the VPNs, and they're definitely taking advantage of that. But then also, once they come in, what's interesting is they're looking for IoT devices to dump credentials. And so IoT devices notoriously don't have great security on them. Sometimes the credentials are hard-coded, or they're stored in clear text, or they have lots of vulnerabilities for that device. So taking advantage of those IoT devices and then using them to move laterally within the organization. So that's the typical life cycle that we see for this threat actor group. So again, if you are either a third party that is working with utilities and transport, or you're in that area, definitely take a look at this attack chain and see what your defenses are against it.
Yeah, and deploy a zero trust architecture, potentially name-based routing off a Cradlepoint router to protect all of those IoT devices. And
zero trust is especially good at really tamping down on these attacks, because once that initial access is made, not being able to move laterally is a deal breaker, right? Yeah. They're stuck. They can't go anywhere, right? Done. So you create an attack surface that is a pinhole compared to what it is without a zero trust network.
Yeah, you make it in, but you can't go anywhere else.
Right.
And of course, our sources that you always provide, which are always fantastic. I even click the links just to kind of dig in a little further. Always appreciate your time, Alex. Great
You're
stuff
welcome,
this week.
Sir.
And if you enjoyed it, hopefully you did. Certainly you can take action on a lot of this tactical information. If you enjoy these kinds of videos, please hit that like